Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, Erik Davis discusses his book High Weirdness, a meditation on psychedelia and existential drift in 1970s California.
In the 2000s, I had this opportunity to work on Philip K. Dick's Exegesis. And the Exegesis is this enormous handwritten private diary that he wrote in the last 10 years of his life, some of which is just bonkers, tedious, crazy, but some of it's brilliant and fascinating and rich. And people who are into Philip K. Dick have always been wanting to see this thing. And so finally there was an opportunity to work on putting out an edition of it, which it was only a tenth of the whole thing. So I got to work on that, and I got my hands dirty with this amazing figure who was crazy and brilliant and mystical and religious and science fictional all at once. And I've been a huge dickhead for a long time, since the 80s. So I was going to write my PhD about Philip K. Dick. That was always what I was going to do. I was just going to write about the exegesis and the religious experience. And the question I had was, what happens to what we might otherwise call religious experience when it also resembles psychosis, a psychedelic trip, and a science fiction novel? Like there's something else going on there, and what do we do with that? But at the very last minute, I realized that I did not want to spend 4 or 5 years inside Philip K. Dick's mind with no escape. So I pulled back and I was like, what the heck what am I going to do? And I realized that I had been telling people, there's his experience here, but it's actually kind of similar to these other experiences. Science fiction, kind of psychotic, maybe there's a drug dimension, it's got some cosmic dimension, it's paranoid, but also sort of religious, sometimes Christian. And I noted that there were these other versions, but a lot of them also happened in California. A lot of them happened in the early 70s. And so I came to think of the early 70s as just this phenomenal, fascinating, rich, bizarre, almost magical time when it was dark, but there was an incredible creativity there. I think it was like a phase of psychedelic culture. It's like after the psychedelics have now permeated people's minds. All this literature has been republished and started to be consumed that had a trippy psychedelic dimension to it. Paranormal, the occult, the science fiction, Lovecraft, all this stuff. And then you have all these people who are experimenting with new lifestyles, but suddenly it's like, whoa, the revolution's not going to happen. Where are we? What are we doing? So this kind of existential drift enters into it. And so that's a very potent environment for new forms of religious experience, is one way of thinking about it. And so it made sense to then try to understand that period, which is so much that's going on with new media, new technologies, new forms of psychological work, things that end up being very influential. Our culture is much more influenced by the 70s than it is by the 60s in terms of paranoia, in terms of surveillance technology, in terms of the politics, even the weird way that the Middle East now echoes, or energy crisis echoes, or weird forms of inflation, like the way the economy is functioning. It's a much more familiar kind of zone. So it was interesting to go back into it and kind of see these echoes as I trace not just Philip K. Dick's story, but Robert Anton Wilson and Terence McKenna as exemplars of this navigation of a new kind of religious experience. It's interesting to think about where that idea of the net comes from. And in the 70s, you have to remember that this is when the ARPANET is developing. So it's like literally when what becomes the internet is happening. It's just happening with some research labs. Nobody knows about it. It's just a kind of technological event. But in the way that I think about history, like I have deep respect for history, for the rigor of archival work, for getting dates right, for not just believing one person's account, et cetera, et cetera. But at the same time, I look at history in a somewhat more, I don't know quite what to call it, not magical, but synchronistic way. That history is often giving you an allegory about what it's about. You know, so you can kind of if you look at history in the right way, you start to understand these deeper features. So even though technically nobody's interacting, or hardly anybody's interacting with the internet's there, and the internet's there in the Bay Area. And there's some way in which the new forms of human potential movement and the changes in psychedelic culture are still operating or echoing this more monumental technological change that has these kinds of paranoid sides to them, or even paranormal sides to them. You know, they were doing paranormal tests with early, computer terminal things, like trying to see if we could do remote viewing using the network. And Jacques Vallée, who was this UFO theorist, was involved in some early networking. And there's a bunch of people who were involved in some of the early technology stuff that were pretty far out individuals. So there's something far out about the technology itself. And then when you turn to these visions that these gentlemen and other people like them have, you'll find that there are these images of networks, or of like databases, or knowledge frames, or the system, ideas of the system. What is the system? What connects it? How does it work? I mean, I think this often happens. There's something on the horizon. That thing is coming. It's hurtling towards us. But in its wave, before it's quite here, we get signals. You know, I think Pound talked about poets being like the antenna of the race, or whatever. I don't know what race means in that context, but I think it's what he said. But the idea that through art and our own experiences, maybe drug experiences, maybe religious experiences, maybe music visions, visionary science fiction, we get little senses of what's coming down the pike. In this very analog era, there was a sense of something coming down, and that it was going to be really significant and very confusing and undermining and reality shifting. And we're sort of in that shift, and it's not very pleasant, and it's kind of terrifying, but you can see why from a distance it has this kind of strange, enchanted quality, even if it's very kind of confusing. And I think that comes through too, the sort of experiences they're having. So in that way, I see them as kind of prophetic, not like prophets in the Old Testament, but that they were anticipating things that come to pass. I've gone through a lot of different phases with it, as you know, my worldview has darkened, and my worldview about California has darkened. And watching, you know, having the blessing and the curse of being interested in the emerging kind of computer culture from the very early 1990s, and just like watching it open up and experiment and open up spaces, and then those spaces get closed, and then other things happen, and and then here we are with this sort of like made in California Apple products everywhere, and like this sort of viral octopus that we can't get out of our heads, and it's just kind of a nightmare. And so like having gone through that whole arc as someone without a pony in the race, without a real investment in it either being a utopia or being a dystopia, being open to different models of it, and thinking about it in terms of California, which has played such an incredible role. And so certainly historically it's been very important, and there's certain reasons that California developed the way that it did. The government saw it as kind of like a petri dish, so it's like, it's not just because it's full of these mad innovators who are just inventing the future. It's that those mad innovators who are inventing the future are getting support in very material ways from the federal government and from the emerging institutions inside. So it's also an institutional story about how does Stanford develop, how does venture capital develop in that particular context, so that something like Silicon Valley can happen there. So there's those kinds of histories too. But there's also a kind of deeper mythological, even whatever, mystical view, which is like it's got the longest, fault line on the planet, and it's like you're riding this edge. And then just historic, if you just like look at the West, whatever the West is, whether we hate it or love it or what our own mixed relationship to it, it's a thing, it's a thing that happened historically. And it just kind of goes and goes and goes, and then it hits the specific, and it's, what does it do? Where does it go? Where does all that energy go? Well, it goes into weird shit. It goes into mysticism and cults and entertainment culture and virtualization, like from movies to VR to psychedelics. It's the first sort of psychedelic country in the modern sense, like in the 20th century sense, 1950s. It's all, so much of it's happening there. So in a way, it's sort of it's kind of like a petri dish for the post-human, and so you get the full range of dark and light in that particular mode. And I mean, one of my great disappointments is that despite all that, and despite all the interesting dimensions and influences that went into computer culture, went into Silicon Valley, that it went the way that it did. And that might be an index of my naivete about how capital works, or what happens to anarchists when they get too much money and they become libertarians, or when good libertarians go bad, or whatever. There's a lot of reasons for the way things worked out, but now it's like California, it was maybe a place where people would dream, and now it's like kind of a stain that we all have around the world.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.